Romans invaded Britain in 55 BC. They're a very well-trained and well-disciplined army. You could only become a Roman soldier if you were 5'10" tall and physically fit. The Roman Empire was rich. They could afford to pay their soldiers to train them. They could afford great weapons for them, like the gladius, their stabbing sword, the pilum, their javelin, their shields, their armour. They were no match for any of the barbarians. And when they came to Britain, they faced the Celts. Now, the Celts were poor society, mainly farmers. And so, when Boudicca revolted in 60 AD, even though she outnumbered the Roman army, 6 to 1, some say 10 to 1, she didn't stand a chance. And her army of naked Celts, painted blue, charging madly at the Romans, were no match for them. And she was killed, along with many of her soldiers. But eventually, by about 400 AD, the Roman Empire collapsed and various barbarian tribes took over various bits of the Roman Empire, and the Saxons took over in Britain with their farm-based economy, again quite poor, but they had the Fyrd, which was the fighting men that they could rely on and call up in times of crisis. Their main tactic was the shield wall, which they used in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings when the Normans invaded from northern France. Now, the Normans had war horses, they had chainmail armour, they had tactics which they used at 1066 as the feigned retreat, the pretended to retreat, which broke the Saxon line, and so they managed to win the Battle of Hastings. And the Normans became the main leaders in England. During this time as well, the Normans promoted the idea of the Crusade, and many knights from Europe went to free the Holy Land. One battle we need to know about is about the Siege of Acre in 1191, when King Richard the Lionheart tried to capture Acre from the great Saracen Saladin using catapults, mining under the towers, but eventually, as most sieges were settled at the time, he managed to do a deal with them in which he took the town. Then we're going to move into the later Middle Ages, when the longbow was developed. It's called the Age of the Longbow, and this was used primarily by the English army. You could always tell Englishmen at the time because they had a hugely developed right arm muscle from pulling their bowstring. And this development greatly changed warfare because it meant that the great Norman knights, the cavalry, which dominated warfare in Norman times, the cavalry charge was the main tactic they used. This began to decline because they would just all get shot dead by the longbowmen, as was shown in 1415 when Henry V took his soldiers over to France and won the Battle of Agincourt against the odds again, against the great French knights, because they had longbowmen to kill them all. In the Agincourt campaign, of course, the first cannon was used at the Siege of Harfleur, and this shows the introduction of gunpowder into warfare. Now, clearly, people might think, oh, cannons, muskets, warfare must change. But actually, it doesn't have that great impact because of the cost of it, because people needed training. And so we look at the Battle of Naseby in 1645 during the English Civil War. And at the Battle of Naseby, the main reason why they won was Cromwell here with his walks and all, was a great cavalry commander and managed to attack the flank of the royalist force. Cannons and muskets did not play a significant role at all in that battle. The Civil War, of course, was caused because of religious problems in the country at the time. Charles I wanted the more beautiful Protestant church than the Puritans did. Charles I charged illegal taxes like ship tax, which Parliament didn't like. And Charles I thought he was sent by God to rule the country, which Parliament didn't like. They thought that Charles should rule alongside them, so these two sides started fighting in 1642. We then move on into the 18th century, where armies become much bigger. It's the age of the redcoat. The British government decides to develop a standing army. They introduce the War Office, where they train soldiers. There's a drill, they have officer training, they give them standard weapons, like the brown bess musket. And so the army becomes far more recognisable in its modern sense of Britain having a standing army. And it's needed, of course, because over the continent is the French Revolution. The whole French nation becomes a fighting machine with every able man in the army, or everybody who's not in the army making bullets, making uniforms for the army, and so the French managed to spread their power across Europe. But in 1815, the British army goes over to Waterloo under the Duke of Wellington, and with the help of the Prussians, that's what the Germans were called at the time, they managed to defeat the French at Waterloo by fighting very defensively, but by being very well trained, using a volley of fire while musketing, firing, then ducking the man behind him, firing too. So another great victory, probably not against the odds as Agincourt, but another great victory nonetheless. We then warfare develops more in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution and lots more processes in strengthening steel. They work out if you rifle the barrels of muskets, then the bullets will go further. You now have percussion cartridges, so no need for gunpowder anymore, percussion shells that explode. So warfare really advances quickly in the 19th century. But this isn't really reflected in the generals and the commanders and the way battles are fought. So in the Crimean War in 1846, you still have the charge of the Light Brigade, where there's a cavalry charge, swords drawn, charging at these modern cannons with percussion shells, which just which slaughter the Light Brigade, of course. The new rifled muskets that are used, new rifles they're called, aren't they, were given out to the soldiers, but the generals even told them that they're any different, and they were surprised at the Battle of Alba they could actually shoot the enemy from so far off. So we're looking at the Crimean War and how this is the old way of fighting, which is the new way of fighting. And trenches were dug round Sebastopol, where the British and the French, the Turks, were attacking the Russians in the Crimea. There's also, of course, the war that Florence Nightingale was a nurse in. We find about how she helped the soldiers too. Then moving into the 20th century, the First World War, which again wasn't the first. It was a war where trenches were used widely, just as they had been in the Crimea, trench warfare. And the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where some people say that Haig was responsible for 60,000 casualties in the first hour of the battle. Others say, hey, no other generals at the time had any better ideas about how to fight these wars. We then go on to look at more modern warfare, the advent of the nuclear age, the idea of asymmetrical warfare, of huge powers like America getting involved in wars with tiny powers like Vietnam. And we focus on the Gulf War of 1991, where the huge power of America, with British help, went attacked the small power of Iraq to support its ally Kuwait. And hopefully, by the end of this story, you will understand how warfare has changed through time,